Welcome, 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 folks, to episode 4 of the 19th Century American System podcast. Today we have quite a show for you. Folks, you know who we have? As usual, the world leading authority on the subject of American system political economy, Mr. Neil Martin. Mr. Neil Martin has gone into the archives and is bringing to us today quite a blockbuster presentation on Henry C. Carey's Principles of Social Science. Now, if you believe you understand economics, if you believe you understand history, if you believe you understand the 19th century, well, you've got a rethink coming, because everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you understood about any of those subjects, Neil is about to blow everything out of the water. So fasten your seatbelt. As usual, this is going to be a two-part presentation. Neil has asked me to do the special honor of giving a brief history, a brief biography of Mr. Carey, and I'm going to interject some of those into the presentation. So right off the top, I'm going to first cover a few things about Mr. Carey, his early years, and then I'm going to start diving into his critiques of slavery, his interactions with Mr. Karl Marx, up all the way to his influence on the Republican Party, and I'm talking about the Republican Party, the 19th century Republican Party, not the Republican Party that all of us have come to know over the last 50 or 60 years, or maybe even less, going back to the advent of Ronald Reagan, or maybe prior. And then we'll take a break, allow Neil to expand even further on each one of these subjects, give you a good insight into Henry C. Carey's thinking as excerpted from his seminal writing, which is just an absolute delight to study. I've been working on this book, Principles of Social Science, for probably a good 6 months now, maybe longer, 3-part, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. If you never get to read another book in your life, you have to spend some time sinking your teeth into this book. And Neil will spend some time giving you some access to some of those core principles in those books. Henry C. Carey, early years, born December 15, 1973, American publisher, political economist, politician from Pennsylvania. Henry C. Carey was the leading 19th century economist of the American school and a chief economic advisor to U.S. President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary to the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, during the American Civil War. Henry C. Carey's central work is The Harmony of Interests, Agricultural, Manufacturing, and Commercial, which he wrote in 1851. If you understand the harmony of interest, then you understand why free trade, why Marxism, why associated economic thoughts related to those two schools are absolute frauds. But I'm going to leave it to Neil to help us understand that. Henry C. Carey, in his book, Harmony of Interest, criticizes free trade, criticizes capitalism, especially of the variety expounded on by Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. He attacked these ideas in favor of the American system of developmentalism through the use of tariff protection and state intervention to encourage national self-sufficiency and national unity. Henry C. Carey, as I said, was a huge critic of the practice of slavery, not necessarily from a moral perspective, but from an economic perspective, which in and of itself is a whole different definition of morality. Henry C. Carey's work on protective tariffs was very influential on the early Republican Party and United States trade policy throughout the start of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. His views on banking and monetary policy were adopted by no other than the Lincoln administration, especially in its issuance of paper fiat currency called the greenbacks as legal tender. So if you're wondering, why have I never heard of this guy? If this guy is so important, how come I've never heard of him? Well, you're about to hear it from the leading authority on the American system, Neil, why Henry C. Carey has been the best kept secret of the 19th century. And then Neil will cover some of this over the next 30 minutes or so. I will come back and give you some more insight into this enigma, this genius, this Renaissance man, this man that you need to become very, very familiar with, especially given the big challenges we face as a nation, the big challenges we face as a globe. If you're one of those people looking for solutions, look no further. Neil, over to you, sir.
Okay, so move on to slide number 1. The previous slide. So this is Henry's the first slide, which has principles of social science and distribution and commerce. Okay, so tonight's presentation will be on Henry Carey's Principles of Social Science, the best book written in the 19th century in political economy. The Principles of Social Science touches upon many subjects in political economy. The two that stand out are distribution and commerce. Distribution deals with what's going to happen to the wage earner, what's going to happen to the industrialist, what's going to happen to the employer, what's going to happen to the people that pay rent, what's going to happen to the people that receive rent. Now, the dismal science and the Karl Marx school, who go hand in hand together, you can't have one without the other, they believed in a zero-sum game. The zero-sum game was either the employer wins out and the laborer gets screwed. The rent receiver wins out, the rent payee gets screwed, right? So there is no harmony of interest between the employee and the employer, right? The British have a horrible view of man, which Karl Marx does not talk about. He doesn't talk about on how the British have no conception of the general welfare. You cannot have a situation where you have your employees making good wages, because if they get good wages, according to the British, it's going to cause an overpopulation problem. That was one of their excuses for not paying people enough money, right? Now you run across a slight problem. If you do not pay your workers enough money, they become the army of non-consumers, which is a term that Henry Carey phrased. Go to the next slide, the next slide, Victor. All right. So Carey describing the theory of distribution through the economic diagram. After I read this quote, we're going to go to the economic diagram. The economic diagram is one of the main important economic diagrams in any political economy book. If this economic diagram was written today in the 21st century, it will hold major clout. So on the left, the trader's proportion is large. The quantity of profit is, however, so small that few can live by trade. Although the rate of interest would be cent per cent, at least no capitalist would think of making investments there. Freight absorbs so large a proportion of the profits that the laborer is the trader's slave, and land is wholly valueless. The rent that there would be demanded for a spot of ground that had been prepared for cultivation and upon which a man could securely labor would be such as to absorb nearly all the produce. Profits, interests, freights, and rents would all be large in proportion, but utterly insignificant in amount. Next slide, please, Victor. This is Henry Carey's famous economic diagram. Over to the far left, you see paper and rags. Think of this as raw materials. The rags is the raw material. The paper is the finished product. You see there's a big distance, a big gap between paper and rags. Rags are cheap, paper high. We look below. Land is valueless. Land has no value. Land is not being used properly by the economy. The economy is not using land properly, right? Then we have slavery. We either have slavery or man, or there's a low view of man. Put it that way, right? We have an extreme low view of man. And we have the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains does not have a good economy. We go to the right, we have Kansas. Things are improving, not enough. We go to St. Louis. The value of man is somewhat gradually rising, but it's too slow. The value of land is gradually rising. The prices for raw materials are slowly approximating. Then we go on to Cincinnati. Cincinnati, you see something, the paper and rags are approximating even more. Man is being appreciated. Labor is being appreciated. There's a higher value of man. Land is becoming more of value. Then we get to Pittsburgh, right? Steel, agriculture, agro-industrial economy. We have industries, right? So land is gaining value. Labor is getting value. Man is not a slave. Then we go to Philadelphia. We have labor increasing in value, land increasing in value, raw materials approximating. Okay, free traders don't talk about this. They don't have Henry Carey's economic diagram, because the end point in economic diagram is that there has to be a high view of man. And that high view of man means that land is valuable, the prices of raw materials and finished commodities approximate, and there's also domestic commerce. To the far left of the economic diagram, there's hardly no domestic commerce, right? Then we go to Philadelphia. Labor is progressing. Land increases in value. Raw materials are approximating, and there's more significant traces of domestic commerce. Free traders never talk about domestic commerce. All they want to talk about is foreign trade, which needs free trade, right? Free trade is to the left of the economic diagram. because man is not being fruitful, multiplying, replenishing the earth, and subduing it. Why would the British want to subdue the earth? If the British wanted to subdue the earth, they would need to have a high view of man. Since they don't have a high view of man, you cannot get to an ultimate stage of perfect domestic commerce. The British system will have countries permanently to the left of the economic diagram. Then we move to New York, right? New York, labor, high value. There's a high view of man. The general welfare is being promoted. Land is high in value. The raw materials are approximating. You see domestic commerce. You don't see that much free trade. You see domestic commerce. And what's domestic commerce? Domestic commerce is the exchanges between town and town, city and town, county and county, state and state. That is domestic commerce. Domestic commerce encourages domestic industries way more than foreign commerce does, right? Even Adam Smith had to admit that. Adam Smith admitted that domestic commerce is more valuable than foreign trade. Now, if you take a look at the economic diagram, foreign trade is to the left. Domestic commerce is to the right. It is impossible for domestic commerce to be on the far left of the economic diagram. And the reason why domestic commerce cannot be on the far left of the economic diagram is because domestic commerce creates a situation where there is a massive base of consumption that the working population has, right? Your workforce is going to be the sole force of consumption. In order to have that, you need a high view of man. And I'm sorry, the British don't have a high view of man concerning political economy. Then we go to the far right, Massachusetts. Perfect conditions for domestic commerce. Land high in value, as Henry Carey says. Freedom. Paper and rags approximating. Raw materials approximating. This is very important. This right here completely blows up the wages fund theory, which communists and free traders like to talk about. Next slide, Victor. Oh, hold on. No, go back to the economic diagram. All right. So to the far left of the economic diagram, the farmer and the laborer are the slaves of the trader, right? The trader has no interest on improving the livelihood of the farmer and laborer. They are just instruments. They're instruments of the trader, right? Henry Carey says there's no investment being made in the Rocky Mountains. No investments at all, right? We have to take a look at what else is happening in the Rocky Mountains. We're gonna see that later on, right? But there's a part where Henry Carey is saying the profits that the trader makes to the far left of the economic diagram are insignificant. These profits don't allow for that many traders to exist. Next slide, Victor. Okay, I want people to keep in mind of the economic diagram. At each step further east, the proportion of the middleman further declines, with corresponding growth in the value of land and labor, and corresponding decline in the rate of profit and of interest, until at length in Massachusetts, we find the producer and the consumer so nearly brought together as to leave but a very few a very small proportion of the total quantity to be divided among the traders in money or in merchandise. Yet there it is that fortunes accumulate with more rapidity than in any other portion of the Western world. So Henry Carey has just stated that the middleman's power is declining. The dismal science, the free trade system, doesn't want the middleman's power declining. Then you have post-Carnes free traders who absolutely know nothing about the history of free trade. The post-Carnes free trader is kind of like a battered wife. The wife that keeps on talking about how good this wife beater is. That's what free trade is. Free trade is a wife beater. It has no type of responsibility or no type of personal drive to improve the livelihood of the population. So these post-Carnes free traders, right? They want to talk about on how good free trade is, but they don't know the past of free trade because they have selective amnesia. Some of them have selective amnesia, and some of them just don't know any better, right? So they don't want to talk about what free trade actually did. And Henry Carey is saying the middleman's power declines, right? But not only that, he is saying, this is big, this is very big, because the free traders and communists don't talk about this. He says there's a decline in the rate of profit and interest. There's a decline in the rate of profit for the employers. There's a decline of interest in the loans that banks give. Okay, hold on. So the economic diagram, when you introduce domestic commerce and domestic commerce gains more ground and more ground, they're saying that the interest rates on loans decrease. That's a good thing. But what else is happening as the interest rates are decreasing? The value of man is rising. The free trade school might or will acknowledge that low interest rates are good, but they're never going to associate low interest rates with a high view of man, because the British system doesn't have a high view of man, right? And then we get to the part where Henry Carey is saying, all right, there's fortunes being made in the West. It's not to the far left of the economic diagram. It's to the far right, where the merchants, the traders are getting more money in the far right of the economic diagram in Massachusetts than in the Rocky Mountains, or more than the South, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, whatever you want to say, right? The South is just completely backwards, right? The South is nowhere near the energy flux density that Massachusetts is having, right? So domestic commerce makes the trader become irrelevant. The trader is the ultimate middleman. So if domestic commerce is making the middleman irrelevant, how come the most hyped up school of political economy, socialism, doesn't want to recognize that? Well, as I said, free trade and socialism go hand in hand together. They need one another to be seen as each other's rival. And they can't have the American system of political economy being known by people. Because if you present the American system of political economy to people, it's going to make Marxists and free traders not credible. they're going to be seen as jabronis, which they are, right? And if they're seen as jabronis, this is going to be good for the Western world and good for the global South. What the global South needs to do, they need to get off this free trade stuff, right? You have some you have some countries in the global South that actually think free trade is beneficial. How long are you going to allow for free trade to happen in your country? Just how long? When is your country going to be economically independent? That's the question to ask, right? Henry Carey stated that the middleman's power is further declining. The middleman's associated with free trade. The middleman is not associated with the American system of political economy. The trader needs free trade. Next slide show, Victor. Something socialists and free traders will never say. The proportion of the capitalist declines with the growth of the power of association and combination. Doing so because the great economy of labor, consequent upon the increased rapidity of the societary circulation that itself increasing with the development of the individuality, it follows necessarily that the rate of profit and the charge for interest must be always lowest in those communities in which the loom and the anvil are placed side by side with the plow and the harrow. Such is the fact is seen on comparing the southern and western states of the Union with the northern and eastern ones, Brazil with France, India with England, or island Portugal and Turkey with Denmark and Belgium. This is one of the most important quotes in Henry Carey's Principles of Social Science. Why is it important? Once again, he is stating that the proportion that the capitalist, the employer gets is declining, right? It's declining. But you know what? They're still making a profit. The reason why they're still making a profit because you have natural law, right? Their proportion is decreasing, but the profit is losing. The laborer, his proportion is increasing, and his wages is also increasing. There's a harmony of interest, right? And then Henry Carey is bringing up this phrase, the power of association and combination. That's domestic commerce, right? So once again, the trader, the employer, their power diminishes when you have domestic commerce, something that people do not want to talk about, right? And if we take a look at how powerful domestic commerce is, right? Henry Carey just dropped the bomb, right? What's the bomb, right? He is saying that the communities that have the loom and the anvil side by side with the plow and the harrow is that the charge of interest is always lowest. In an agro-industrial economy, the interest rates will be low if they go by natural law. The free traders are never going to say that, right? How is a socialist gonna attribute domestic commerce to low interest rates? They don't know nothing about banking. They want all national banks, right? They don't want private enterprise in banking. Well, all you do with that is you regulate the banks. They seem to not understand that you can actually regulate banks and they can work good. You can actually regulate the economy and it works great, right? But there's something more important in this quote. Victor, go back to the economic diagram, please. Okay. Henry Carey is stating that you have regions in the world. Some belong to the far left of the economic diagram, and let's repeat what's on the far left of the economic diagram. Slavery, low view of man, raw materials cheap, finished commodities expensive, land valueless, right? To the far right of the economic diagram, the laborer is in a state of freedom. He's respected. He is seen as someone as very necessary for the laborer to consume. He needs a large base of consumption. The economy needs a large base of consumption. And you see that to the far right of the economic diagram. Land is high in value. The raw materials and finished commodities are approximating in value, right? So something like the South and the Western states belong to the far left of the economic diagram. The northern and eastern parts of the United States of America belong to the far right of the economic diagram. Brazil belongs to the far left of the economic diagram. France to the far right of the economic diagram. India, a colony of the British, belongs to the far left of the economic diagram. To the far right, England belongs to the far right of the economic diagram. Ireland, who the British screwed. Portugal, who the British screwed. Turkey, who the British screwed. How were they screwed? The Act of Union in the 1800s destroyed Ireland as a domestic commerce economy. Portugal, the Muthian Treaty in 1703, which Karl Marx doesn't pay attention to and just outright dismisses it. He makes fun of Frederick List for talking about the Muthian Treaty. That's how stupid Karl Marx is. Not strategic at all whatsoever, right? Portugal is to the far left because they sacrifice domestic commerce to please the British. Turkey, under the influence of France and England, went with a tariff for revenue only, which means we're going to have a tariff, a low tariff, but this means foreign goods from France and England can supplant domestic industries in Turkey. And that is what ultimately destroyed the Ottoman Empire, which is not spoken about. That tariff that Turkey signed with the British and French is not seen as the death of Turkey because economic history is in a dark age. It's still in a dark age. No one wants to tell the truth about the history of trade and commerce, right? And then Henry Carey says, Denmark and Belgium are to the far right of the economic diagram. What do they have? What do the northern and eastern parts of the United States, France, England, Denmark, and Belgium have? They have machinery. They have domestic commerce. They have canals. They have infrastructure. They have independent economies. Meanwhile, Turkey, Portugal, Ireland, Brazil, the Western states, and the good old South, Southern heritage. Southern heritage is free trade and mental slavery. You have slavery too, but the South suffers from mental slavery because they believed in free trade so much. The South is to the far left of the economic diagram. They're pathetic. We don't need to see an economy like that ever again, right? In order for a country to get to the far left of the economic diagram, they have to listen to the British. They have to be British concubines, right? we take a look at India. The British oversaw millions and upon millions of Indians dying of famine in India, all because of free trade. And free trade is not blamed for this. The famines in India are not blamed for free trade. They're probably blamed for overpopulation. That's what they said about Ireland, right? So this law of distribution that Henry Carey is talking about, the economic diagram, it explains so much. That's why the principles of social science is so perfect. It's very unique. You can read 2 pages and Henry Carey is just going over dense material. All right, next slide show.
Neil, do you want to take a break now? Or you want to do the next slideshow first?
Next slideshow first. Okay, a lesson for David Hume. David Hume was a famous British philosopher, economist of the 18th century. He was an underling to Lord Shelburne, but he's very important in political economy history, right? Had he looked around the world, he would have seen that interest was low in all those countries in which land and labor were high in price, while high in those in which land was cheap and man was enslaved. Further, he would have seen that precisely as axes or engines are improved in quality and as labor is rendered more productive, the owner of such machines is forced to content himself with a rate of consumption steadily diminishing in the proportion borne by it to the cost of the machine, leaving to the man who uses it a constantly diminishing proportion of a constantly increasing quantity. Another important quote by Henry Carey. Now, David Hume, Henry Carey cites as liking low interest rates. But the British system economists, people like David Hume, they don't have a high view of man. They have a low view of man, right? The British system economists do not promote the general welfare. You need to have a high view of man to have productive employment. You can't have a low view of man and have productive employment. You didn't see slaves becoming machinists. You didn't see slaves working in chemistry. You didn't see slaves making massive breakthroughs in various fields of agriculture and in science and in machinery. That just you just didn't see that, right? The productive powers of labor increases when you have when your population has a culture with a high view of man. If your population has a culture with a low view of man, what type of technologies are they going to introduce to the world? Windmills and solar power. Let's take a look at the West, Western Germany, and the United States of America. The United States of America and the West has poured more money into windmills and solar panels than in making breakthroughs for NASA, the space program, and for fusion power. So we have an economy that is more devoted into spending money for windmills and solar panels than in for fusion power. And what Henry Carey states, right? He says that further, he would have seen that precisely as axes or engines are improved in quality and as labor is rendered more productive, the owner of such machines is forced to content himself with a rate of compensation steadily diminishing in proportion borne by it to the cost of the machine. Henry Carey is saying when you have energy flux density, the wages of the employee rises, and the 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 cut that the employer gets decreases. The British system of political economy they're never going to state that, because if they state that, that means they want an economy that has a high view of man. And if their economy has a high view of man, you break off from the British, right? An easy way for the United States of America and for Europe, for Africa, to Ibero-America, for Asia, to break away from the British, have a high view of man. All right, we can take a break, Victor.
You just heard it, people. You just heard it from the horse's mouth. The world's leading authority on the subject of American system of political economy, revealing one of the best kept secrets of the 19th century. This man, Henry C. Carey, was the economic advisor to President Abe Lincoln, arguably the greatest American president who ever lived. This gentleman, Henry C. Carey, was responsible for Abraham Lincoln's economic policies. You've heard of Lincoln, you haven't heard of him. Why? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Go back to 1853 in response to the abomination called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a justification of slavery. Henry Carey wrote and published a seminal book which everybody should read if you really want to understand what the Civil War was about, if you want to understand why the British have been the enemy of mankind ever since that transition about 500 years ago from the Dutch system to the British system. Read this book, The Slave Trade, Domestic and Foreign, Why It Exists and How It May Be Extinguished. Henry C. Carey's criticism of slavery 7 years before the Civil War, before Lincoln became president, and Carey had the opportunity finally to put his thoughts into practice in economic form. His criticism of slavery. For those who say the Civil War wasn't about slavery, Lincoln supported slavery, read the book. Let's talk about his interaction with Karl Marx. 1852. Karl Marx was the European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune. Henry C. Carey was a writer for the New York Daily Tribune. Marx privately, as they were both correspondents for the New York Daily Tribune, referred to Henry Carey as the only American economist of importance. But behind Carey's back, Karl Marx was highly critical of Carey's views because he considered them as obstructive of the communist revolution. The only American economist that Karl Marx ever respected wiped the floor with Karl Marx, and yet you've never heard of him. Never heard of him. Talk about Henry C. Carey's influence on the Republican Party. Never heard of him. Was hugely influential in shaping the nationalist and protectionist economic policy of the early Republican Party. Through his role as a public intellectual, a party operative, and an advisor to numerous figures. During the American Civil War, Carey was a trusted advisor to both President Lincoln and to Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase. He, Henry C. Carey, directly assisted in the drafting of the Republican tariff legislation from 1857 through the Civil War. And his thought also influenced President Lincoln's banking and finance policy through the passage of the National Bank Act of 1863 and all subsequent Treasury policies. You want to talk about his criticism of Ricardo and Malthus? Going back to the principle of social science, Carey delivers a lengthy rebuke. Lengthy rebuke, 1857, 3 years before Lincoln became president, 3 years before Henry C. Carey became the chief economic advisor to probably the greatest American president ever. He sharply distinguishes value as man's power to command the always gratuitous services of nature, the measure of man's power over nature. He calls the idea that power and wealth of the laborer will tend to increase, both absolutely and relative to that of capital, as population and association increases. He calls this the most beautiful of all the laws recorded in the book of science. The theory of labor power, labor saved, the theory of value. Well, you've never heard of it. Well, Neil is about to dive into the second part of his presentation so you can understand why Henry C. Carey is the biggest secret that has been kept from you up till now.
Okay.
Let's go back to that next slide. And Neil.
So my favorite part of the Principles of Social Science is Volume 2, Chapter 28. The reason why Volume 2, Chapter 28 is so important to me is Henry Carey uses an approach in talking about commerce and trade, and he makes trade and commerce into a philosophy. He's very direct in what trade does, and he's very direct in what commerce does, right? And all one can do is think about how Henry Carey is talking about commerce, how he's talking about domestic commerce, and how can anyone in their right mind reject domestic commerce and go with trade, go with foreign trade. So here we have the quote. Commerce diminishes the necessity for the transporter services and lessens his power. Trade makes him the master of the man who drive the plow and follow the harrow. The one opens mines and builds furnaces and creates the power to make local roads. The other destroys the power to support them, even where they have been made. But it creates great thoroughfares whose management is so directed as to tax to local commerce for the support of the distant one, and thus to increase the necessity for immigration and the need for roads. So Henry Carey, the first sentence is very powerful. He says, commerce decreases the power of the transporter services, right? Let's go back to the economic diagram, Victor. All right, so commerce is over to the far right. Trade is over to the far left. Henry Carey states, that furnaces, mines are open where you have commerce at. Where you do not have commerce at that is dominant, you have trade, and the trader has a heavy influence on the economy, right? The trader makes the laborer and the farmer into slaves, right? Now, if free trade claims to be so humanitarian, how come they are allowing for the trader to make slaves out of men? How can you have an economic system that claims to be humanitarian but makes slaves out of the population, doesn't allow for them to build furnaces, doesn't allow for them to open mines, doesn't allow for agriculture to become a science, doesn't allow for the earth to be a great labor savings bank for the country. That term, labor saving bank, comes from Henry Carey's The Past, Present, and Future. A labor saving bank is what commerce takes advantage of. The free trade system does not take advantage of the great bank called the earth. They just don't do it. Right? You can go to the next slide, Victor. Okay. Commerce develops the treasures of the earth. Commerce promotes the development of the treasures of the earth and enables men to come nearer together, to find instant demand for all their faculties, and to accumulate wealth and power to be used in peaceful pursuits of life. Trade causes the exhaustion of the soil and the dispersion of man, while stopping the circulation of society and causing large numbers of the people to be unemployed and ready to occupy themselves in the work of war and plunder. Trade made the War of 1812. Trade and dispersion made the Great Florida War of 1831 at a cost of $30 million. Thirst for territory, consequent upon the exhaustion of the southern states, caused the appropriation of Texas, followed by the Mexican War and the seizure of California. Henry Carey is telling you what is the economic policy and what is the foreign policy of free trade, British free trade. The economic policy and foreign policy of British free trade, one is war, second, economic backwardness. The South, look what the South did, right? The South exhausted the soil of the South. How did they do that? Free trade agriculture. We're going to have a cash crop, cotton. It destroyed the land of the South. That was a man-made disease. Free trade, if you want to talk about free trade, just say British free trade is a man-made disease. It is unnatural. When you do not follow the laws of natural laws, you get burnt, right? And this policy of free trade destroyed the United States. It also caused dispersion of men, right? If anybody reads Henry Carey, right? If you read The Harmony of Interest, if you read The Principles of Social Science, and read all these other British economists and socialist economists, if they exist, and they talk about the 19th century, they are not going to talk about dispersion like Henry Carey does. When Henry Carey saw dispersion, massive immigration from the north to the west, he says the economy is not organized, right? If the economy is not organized, how can you take advantage of the treasures of the earth, right? Henry Carey calls the earth the great labor saving bank. Free traders don't call the earth that. Environmentalists don't, socialists don't, communists don't, Western communists don't, communists who like China and Russia don't, because they're not thinking like Henry C. Carey. This is the stuff that you have to read Lyndon LaRouche to have a sharp and clear understanding of Henry C. Carey. If you take the average mind and you don't give them Lyndon LaRouche, and you tell them to read Henry C. Carey, they're going to come up with a few things, but they're not going to be able to make the breakthroughs, the discoveries, and have ideas and pose the right questions after reading Henry C. Carey. I get the most out of Henry C. Carey by knowing the mind of Lyndon LaRouche, right? So this phrase of commerce versus trade is very important. I can talk on this for hours, but let's go to the next slideshow, Victor. Okay, commerce is devoted to internal improvements, infrastructure. Commerce looks homeward, seeking to promote domestic intercourse by the improvement of rivers, the construction of harbors, and the opening of mines. Trade holding such intercourse in small esteem, and measuring the prosperity of a country by the extent of its intercourse with distant people, looks altogether outward. The one will give value to land at home. The other seeks new lands and conquers California, sending expeditions to Japan, to the rivers of South America, and to the coast of Africa, while declining to remove the obstacles by which the navigation of the Mississippi is impeded. Commerce seeks to make a rich people with a cheap and therefore strong government. Trade makes a splendid and wasteful and therefore weak government. The periods of protection have been those of economy and rapidly growing strength. Those of free trade, and particularly the current one, have been those of greatest splendor, waste, and weakness. Commerce is devoted to internal improvements. Henry Carey is saying the United States of America, if it wants to make progress, they have to be wedded towards commerce, right? Because when you have a policy of domestic commerce, you build infrastructure. What type of infrastructure do you build? Water management projects. You build nuclear power plants. You work on fusion power. You still have coal. You still have oil. You still have gas, right? You build hospitals. You work on education. You build high-speed rail. You build magnetic levitation rail, right? But the free traders don't want to do that. What do they want to do? According to Henry Carey, they said, we want to base all of our prosperity on trade with distant people. They don't want to put any type of effort into domestic commerce. We're going to go into the future. This book was written in the late 1850s. We're going to go into the 1890s. No, the late 1880s. William McKinley gives one of his greatest speeches, May 18th, 1888. He is stating that domestic commerce is big time in the United States of America. You can take a rail line in Pennsylvania or other parts of the United States of America. They have more commerce than European nations. And you don't want to take domestic commerce seriously. If you have domestic commerce, let me repeat myself. If you have domestic commerce, you have a large base of consumption. The United States of America by the 1890s, Thomas Brackett Reed gave a speech in 1894 in which he stated, the United States of America has 70 million people. We do the consuming of 700 million people, and the population was only 1.5 billion. You do the math. That's a big base of consumption. And you want to tell me you want to focus on foreign commerce and not domestic commerce? All these people, Thomas Brackett Reed, William McKinley, They knew about Henry Carey. They knew about Henry C. Carey, the greatest political economist of the 19th century. And free traders and Marxists don't want to recognize that. Because if they recognize that, their school of political economy will become worthless. And their school of free trade and communism or socialism, whatever you want to call it, is worthless. Right? And so another point that Henry Carey is making is, right, as I said before, the free traders, they don't see infrastructure as important. Let's look at it today. What does Joe Biden call infrastructure? Windmills and solar panels. When infrastructure comes into discussion, what do Confederates say? Republicans. What do Democrats say? Neoliberals, copperheads. Oh, it's going to cost too much money. But they always give a blank check to the military-industrial complex. They give a blank check to the military-industrial complex, and they don't want to build infrastructure in the United States of America. They don't want to use the Great Labor Savings Bank. It's there for our usage. But the free trade crowd that loves foreign trade, they're not going to use it because they have no commitment to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. If they wanted to subdue the earth, they'll be following the economic policies of Henry C. Carey. But if they want to go the British way and be concubines of the British, they're going to go with free trade. Next slide, Victor. Carey on the earth and man. Rarely do you see a political economist give you his view of earth and his view of man in the same paragraph or same sentence. The treasures of nature are boundless in extent, the earth being a great reservoir of wealth and power, requiring for their full development only the carrying into full effect the idea expressed by the magic word, association. Let's take a step back. Henry Carey is calling the treasures of the earth boundless and in extent. He's not saying that the treasures of the earth are finite, like satanic figures like David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus are saying, right? And the environmentalist movement and the degrowth movement, which are just they are just Malthusians dressed in sheep's clothing, but they're wolves, right? And so that statement, the treasures of the earth are boundless in extent, that's a great view of the earth. If it's boundless in extent, what is man going to do with them? Henry Carey is calling the earth the great reservoir of wealth and power. Free traders don't talk about the earth that way. Marxists don't talk about the earth that way. Environmentalists don't talk about the earth that way. But the American system of political economy does, right? And then Carey is saying you need to have a magic word to activate the great reservoir of wealth and power. And he says you need association. If anybody reads Henry C. Carey's Principles of Social Science, count how many times Henry C. Carey says association in that book. You go to Internet Archive, type down Henry C. Carey, Principles of Social Science, Volume 1. Type down that word association. See how many times it comes up. It comes up a whole leap of times. Association is Henry Carey's baby, right? In Chapter 8, Volume 1 of the Principles of Social Science, Henry Carey is saying association is commerce, domestic commerce, right? if you want to use the great labor saving bank as a great reservoir of power and wealth, you need domestic commerce. That's how important domestic commerce is, right? And anybody who is not talking about domestic commerce, anybody not talking about the reason why we need economic corridors is for development and for domestic commerce, they're doing political economy a disservice. Next slide show, Victor. Okay, this is the last one. Association, Henry Carey's baby. The less the power of association, the less the artisan and the man who follows the plow are enabled to work in combination with each other. The greater is always the difficulty of obtaining roads, mills, or money, and the greater the tendency towards recession from each other of the prices of raw materials and finished commodities, the former falling and the latter rising, as has been so long the case in the United States. So Henry Carey is saying your economy goes down when you don't have power of association. Victor, go back to the economic diagram. So in the economic diagram, there's difficulty in building roads, mills, and getting money. The United States of America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Ibero-America, the Caribbean, certain places in Asia, they have a difficulty in building roads, building manufacturing, getting money. Why? They're not dedicating their economy to domestic commerce. Take a look at the United States of America. Why is it so hard to build infrastructure in the United States of America? Why is it so hard to get manufacturers back in the United States of America? Why is it so hard to have credit in the United States of America? Because the people who are running the Democratic Party and Republican Party, the city of Wall Street and the city of London, don't want that to happen. They don't want to see association. They don't want to see domestic commerce in the United States of America. They don't want to see that. What they see, right? They don't want to see the United States of America becoming a domestic commerce powerhouse again. Because if you have the United States of America going along the route of being a big domestic commerce powerhouse, that means bye-bye, England. See you later. We're going with Henry Carey's policy of promoting domestic commerce. And how are you going to promote domestic commerce? You have to concentrate on power of association. Animals do not have the power of association. They don't have domestic commerce. They don't know what it is, right? The power of association and commerce is like, they're like this. They're close. They're one. So domestic commerce, the power of association creates a diversity of employments, right? If you have a diversity of employments, this means you're going to have so many skills and so many talents for your population to absorb, right? If we take a look at Sub-Saharan Africa, what can they do with credit? What can they do with credit if they don't have basic economic infrastructure? Basic economic infrastructure is going to have to be built. If you talk to free traders will tell you that Africa needs infrastructure to increase free trade. That's not going to happen. The people who want free trade in sub-Saharan Africa, the West, they have no intention on going by Henry Carey's distribution theory and his theory of domestic commerce. Because if you read volume 2, chapter 28 of the Principles of Social Science, you will see how powerful Henry Carey is when he is conveying the idea on how important commerce is and how sinister and evil trade is. That's what I got. And I'm done with the class, with the presentation.
You all heard the man. The world's leading authority on the subject of American system of political economy, breaking it down. So now we have episode 4 under our belt. Please stay tuned for episode 5. We're still warming up. We're just getting started. We're foreshadowing where this is going. Our goal is to build an army of well-educated, well-trained, well-trained advocates of the American system of political economy, wherever you are, whatever country you're in, whatever state you're in, whatever locality you're in, join the fight. One of LaRouche's famous sayings back in the 70s is, you have to learn to use your mind the same way a boxer uses his fist. This fight is not going to be won on social media. This fight is not going to be won wagging fingers at public protests. This is a battle of ideas. And if you want to be part of this fight for the future of humanity, you have to get to become friends with people like Henry C. Carey, people like Gottfried Leibniz, people like John Baptiste Colbert, people like Alexander Hamilton, people like Lyndon LaRouche, and you have to learn from people like Neil Martin. So this brings to an end our 4th episode. We'll announce when the 5th episode is coming up. Stay tuned. See you next time we have our next show. Goodbye and God bless.